So let me just quickly go through what the format of this evening will be. As I've said, we have 6 very distinguished panelists, and we will be hearing from each of them in short 5-minute presentations. And then we will engage the panel, Susan, Jean, and I, in a cross-panel discussion for about a half hour. So the whole speaking program should take no more than an hour. And then we'd like to open it up to questions and comments from the audience and give you an opportunity to weigh in on this discussion. What I would like to do is ask, and I'll go in alphabetical order actually, is Richard Briffault to speak first. And Richard is the Joseph B. Chamberlain Professor of Legislation at Columbia Law School, and he's also the Vice Chair of the Citizens Union Board of Directors. And there is more information on the back of the program in terms of the biographical data of the panelists. So Richard, why don't you open it up and start. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure how much light I'm going to be able to shed on all the questions that were asked by the sponsors, but I hope can shed a little bit of light on some of them and maybe in general present what I think the questions are in terms of the city debate, and I'm going to make 5 points. One is about term limits in general, the very idea of term limits. Term limits are generally characterized as a denial of the democratic right to vote for the candidate of your choice. That's often a reason why some organizations, including, I think, Citizens Union, was opposed to term limits in '93 and '96. The usual phrase by critics of term limits is that we have term limits, they're called elections. So long as the people are willing to vote for someone, that person, he or she, should be allowed to stand for office and be elected and re-elected. And that, I think, is the basic democratic principle. But democracy in theory is often in tension with democracy in practice. And we've become aware that incumbents have enormous advantages in elections in terms of public awareness of them, in terms of their fundraising ability, in terms of their ability to use their office to promote re-election. And this is especially true, I think, of executive branch officials. It's also a problem in areas, and many parts of the country and many parts of the city lack real two-party competition, so that the competitive process, which we rely on for democracy, is often absent. There's also a lot of evidence that third terms and later often turn to be lackluster or worse, even for successful officials. If you think about the mayors who've had third terms, LaGuardia, Wagner, Koch, or some of the governors who've had third or fourth terms, Rockefeller, Cuomo, Pataki, typically by the third or later terms, the incumbent loses in energy and engagement, and you get the best of them early on, the worst comes towards the end. And finally, in terms of this issue, is it consistent with democracy, is the fact that term limits are actually widespread in practice, especially for executive office. We have the 2-term limit for president. 37 states impose consecutive term limits on their governors. A large number of big cities, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, San Diego, San Francisco, impose term limits on their mayors. Less widespread, but still out there, are legislative term limits. 15 states have legislative term limits. I think it's less common at the local level. So if we're talking about how democracy works in practice, you can have term limits and also have democracy. Second question, how long should the term limits be? Are we talking about 2 terms or 3, 8 years or 12? And that's part of the debate that we're having now too. In most places that have term limits, particularly the presidential term limits and all the gubernatorial term limits are 2 terms or less. Virginia has a 1-term limit. And most of the mayoral term limits out in other jurisdictions are 2 terms also. Most of the state legislative terms are also 2, 6 or 8 years, although a handful of state legislatures have 12 years. I think there's no obvious right answer on this one. We have to balance the virtues of new blood versus experience, as we also have to think about the balance of power within city government. Given the strength the mayoral position has, do we want to strengthen the council? We might want to think about different term limits for different parts of the government. And within the New York City system, I think as we saw with the dramatic turnover in city government in 2001 and the dramatic turnover that might occur again if term limits continue in 2009, there might be something to be said for 3 terms which would permit more staggered departures in order to prevent the total turnover that we saw, or the near total turnover we saw in 2001. Third question, how should this be decided? By local law or by popular referendum? There's no magic to either one in the abstract. Referenda are often marked by low turnout, usually lower than elections for elected officials. In the 1993 referendum that approved term limits, 45% of the voters who actually turned out to vote in the mayoral election didn't bother to cast a ballot on the term limits question. And again, in 1996, 36% of the voters who turned out to vote in the presidential election didn't bother to cast a ballot on the term limits point. Although term limits prevailed by wide margins in both of those races, there was a large degree of no participation. And of course, just to be perfectly clear, there's no legal requirement for a referendum, even to amend a law adopted by referendum, as the term limits were once modified to allow those serving the short 2-year term to get an extra term. And yet, given the history of doing this by referendum in New York City, the wide margin of approval given by those voting in those elections, and the considerable public suspicion of elected officials doing things that appear to be in their self-interest, it seems that there's a good argument that whatever the abstract principles might require or not require, there's a good argument that it seems only right that in this city, at this time, a matter of a major change in the term limits law should require the direct participation of the people. A fourth point, which is the financial crisis. What is the relevance of the financial crisis to this, and of the mayor's special abilities in dealing with this mayor's special abilities in dealing with the financial crisis in justifying a special exception? It seems to me that this argument is really a direct attack on term limits. What people are saying is that circumstances and talent are more important than general rules designed to limit power and promote rotation in office. Well, there will always be talented people, at least sometimes, and there will always be unusual times. If we count 9/11, we've had 2 moments of extreme crisis in this decade alone. I think everyone thought that 9/11 was a real crisis, but we went ahead with a regularly scheduled election and changed mayors, putting a political novice in office in the middle of that crisis. I think few people today regret that. If you believe circumstances are crucial, you should be against term limits altogether, because we're never going to know what the circumstances are going to be. It's hard, I think you're being inconsistent if you say we can have term limits and special exceptions. Related to that is the question of whether, even if we think the fiscal crisis is a special exception, whether giving the mayor another term is really necessary. The mayor has approximately 15 months, now 14 and a half, in his current term to address the fallout from the Wall Street crisis. That's 2 budget cycles. The current one, which will surely have to be revised, there'll surely have to be changes in revenues and service expenditures in the current budget, and the budget that will be adopted in July 1, 2009. Whether he serves a 3rd term or not, Mayor Bloomberg will be the one setting the course and laying the foundation for addressing the financial crisis, even if he doesn't serve another term. Indeed, you could argue that he would be a better Wall Street crisis mayor if he wasn't distracted by the politics of seeking re-election and could focus on the crisis alone. Last point, there is the way this is all being done. The mayor promised a charter revision commission last January, but never acted on it. The whole issue was delayed 9 months. It's that charter commission that actually could have given us the information that our opening moderators were asking about. How do term limits work? Is the council stronger or weaker? Is the mayor stronger or weaker? How do we balance off the benefits of rotation in office versus the loss of experience? How has it worked in other jurisdictions? If we'd had a charter commission, if we'd had these past 9 months, we actually might have those answers. Instead, this is being presented as an emergency rush job, requiring instantaneous action. If this could wait from January until October, it could wait another month or 2. Until after the presidential election. I think a lot of us are distracted by the presidential election. Until after the Wall Street crisis settles down, if it settles down. Until we begin to see the effect of the National Rescue Plan. And most importantly, until this has had time to percolate through the people, through community organizations, through neighborhood newspapers, through public forums like this. We need to have more public discussion about this. We need to have more forums like this, which have had more times for preparation rather than just 6 days. There should be real public hearings around the city, not just 2 in City Hall. If this is going to be done by local law, the council should wait until the people are given a chance to think about this and until they can be heard from before the council actually acts. We need to have time for public opinion to gel. It could very well be the public opinion wants this. But whether democracy comes out of the legislative process or through a referendum, it needs time. And the one thing it's not being given is time.
Thank you, Richard.